Yeah. Yep, bro.
18-year-old student and rising athletic star, Kelvin Taylor, lovingly known as KJ, lives at home with his parents.
Feeling positive, man. It's all in the mind.
I loved Kay so much. Kay just was special to me, his dad, our family, his classmates, his friends. There was no doubt in KJ's mind that his mother loved him, nor his father. We both loved the ground he walked on.
He was raised right. He was raised by a great mother and father. Every room he walked in, it got brighter, you know, and if you was having a bad day and you seen KJ, you smiled. He was someone you just needed to be around.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, not for sure.
When I got home from work, KJ was on his phone sitting on the end of the couch.
All right, bye. Hey, Mom.
Hey, kiddo.
How was your day?
Oh, good, honey.
I heard his friends was on the motorcycles. And he said, Mom, I'll be back.
Oh, I'll see you for dinner.
Okay.
And I just looked up, and he got on the back of the bike. And then left. Kay was just different.
KJ is only just starting to fulfill his extraordinary athletic talent on the field.
Kay loved to play sports. Kay was a sports person. He was always playing football, from football to basketball, from basketball to AAU basketball, back to football. He was always in a sport.
God had blessed him with just raw talent. He could move, he could run, he could control his body better than anybody. From day one, you knew that he was special.
He really had the potential to be a next Tavon Austin or Wes Welker. He was the total package. He had everything that you were looking for in a player.
He knew what he didn't have in the neighborhood when he was growing up. And so he wanted to go to school, and he wanted to become successful.
All right, boys, let's go. Let's go.
He was great in other sports, like basketball. Football was his calling. Football was Kay's way out of here.
Hey.
He was wise. He knew that football was going to open doors for him and change his life. This is the journey that he was on.
In 2020, KJ helped his high school team become state champions and had his eye on West Virginia college football and beyond.
There's no doubt in my mind that I wouldn't be watching my nephew on Saturdays. He said that once he made it, his plans was to come back and build a training facility to help train the youth and get them as best prepared to be successful and go further than him.
Let's go, bro. I got you.
The thing about KJ, he was going to be great, no matter what he did.
Where's your emergency?
Hello, somebody just got shot up in here on Central Avenue. Someone just got shot at Sally's.
Okay.
It was a car that drove by.
Damn, I just heard shots. I'm looking out my window.
Dispatchers were receiving 911 calls that a shooting had occurred. There had been multiple shots fired in the Central Avenue area of Charleston, West Virginia.
Attention 408. Reported shooting, 829 Central Avenue. Time now 2013.
Officers were actually in the area, pretty close by.
Charleston Police Department arrived on scene within seconds of the actual shooting.
They arrived on scene. It was really chaotic.
They weren't sure that the shooter had fled the scene. They approached that scene with caution.
They located the victim laying on the ground. He's had a single gunshot wound to the chest. Several other people around him frantically trying to give him assistance. Some people were saying it was a truck had driven by and fired several shots, which struck the victim. Everybody on scene said, "Hey, that's KJ Taylor."
There was a knock at the door, and it was my homegirl, but she was out of breath.
It's KJ! KJ!
And she screamed, "KJ just got shot."
Metro Medic 437 responds to the area, Central Avenue, Glenwood Avenue.
I ran down the street. It is so many people out there, like, so many people. And there's this young guy screaming.
Let me through! That's my son! KJ!
I'm trying to get through there, and the police won't allow me to get to there. And all I see is my son, laying on the ground.
KJ was Tara Richmond's only son. He was the light in his mother's eyes. As a parent, I can't imagine what Tara went through.
KJ is rushed to the ER.
Me and my husband chased that ambulance all the way down the street. And then one of my homegirls pulled up, and she drove us to the hospital.
Soon after, Charleston detective John Hill arrives at the crime scene.
What we got? It was still kind of chaotic. There was tons of people everywhere. We put the crime scene tape kind of farther back to where it gives us space to process the scene.
They're having to worry about, the collection of evidence and the preservation of evidence, keeping that crime scene secure.
I walked over to the corner where it occurred, right in front of the corner store. And there were several bullet holes into the window. The first thing we look for is usually like shell casings. The bullet fragments, so we did find several bullet fragments that went through the window of the corner store. If we locate a possible weapon, we could kind of tie it back to that scene. The faster we can solve it and get somebody in custody, the better.
It was close to 9 p.m. when Tara Richmond received the news that no parent ever should have to receive.
And they told us that they did everything they could do. But my baby didn't make it. And it crushed me. And I've been crushed ever since.
Well, as I'm walking through the hospital, I see my brother and my sister-in-law come walking out of the hospital. Both of them had their heads down, crying. I just remember looking at them, thinking to myself, no, not Kay, no.
KJ had never had any problems with the police, but there's several incidents that have occurred, like shootings in the past, around the corner store there. I knew there was a camera on a pole based on other investigations that I've had. If it was active, if it was working, it might help us out, might identify who was there with KJ and get an actual video footage of the incident.
I would not be able to sleep until I got to see what was on that camera because of the potential of what it could bring to the investigation.
You ready? Yeah. You get a license plate, we can track that license plate down to see, who the vehicle's registered to, who's the owner, where they live at. Because sometimes the video's clear enough to where you actually see inside of vehicles and see faces. Could make or break your case. It's what we live for as police officers.
Can you cue it up to just before 7 p.m.? Okay, play it from there.
As soon as I open it up, I see the corner store, Central Avenue, Glenwood Avenue. I see the entire area where the incident occurred. We see KJ and his two friends, they show up on scene riding dirt bikes.
It's a weird feeling because you're getting ready to watch the last moments of someone's life. And they have no idea that it's coming.
Rewind. Freeze it.
They're coming down Glenwood Avenue.
Play on.
They turn in front of the corner store.
Zoom in.
KJ was wearing a red shirt. Park their dirt bikes, get off, kind of hanging out and talking to people right in front of the store.
Hold it. Play it again.
You see one of KJ's friends go inside, and KJ's wearing this red shirt. He's just kind of standing outside, waiting on his friend to get out.
There it is. Rewind. Play it again. Zoom in.
You see KJ approaching the store as he is getting closer to the door. You see the suspect vehicle come into view.
You see it come by at a high rate of speed.
You see a very brief moment where they hit the brakes.
You actually see muzzle flash coming off the glass of the store.
There were multiple shots fired.
And then KJ falling. And then the suspect vehicle continues fleeing the scene, and next thing you know, it's chaos. People are running around.
These are not grown men, these are children. And they are running and they are hiding, they are afraid. It's heartbreaking. This is not just a video, this is real life. And this is a moment where a child is stolen from their family.
Rewind.
We pause it. See if I can get a good picture of who's in that truck.
Zoom in.
You could not see who was driving that vehicle. You could not distinguish what the license plate was.
While the poll camera was beneficial for us in that it showed the actual shooting, at that point we didn't know anything about the occupants of the vehicle.
All we know is that truck is the suspect vehicle. Whoever was in that truck, that's the person that killed KJ Taylor.
Without a license plate to trace the vehicle, Detective Hill canvasses the area for more cameras.
KJ's friends fled from the scene traveling east on Central Avenue towards Five Corners. And it's the intersection on the west side of Charleston that a bunch of streets all meet at once. We need to check these spots. There's a business right there at Five Corners that has a great camera that points right at Central Avenue. Maybe if they stopped at the light, I could see inside and maybe see some faces.
Detective Hill takes the hardware store footage back to the station.
Can you cue it up to 6:50 p.m., please? Sure. Scroll it on, please.
All of a sudden, there it goes. The suspect vehicle's flying at high rate of speed.
Rewind.
I rewind it, paused it, and did step by step, frame by frame. And as I'm watching it, I look in and I can see, hey, there's two people in that truck.
Zoom in.
We got to see how big they were. We got to see what they're wearing.
And I can see the driver's got a white shirt on and the passenger's got a red shirt on. Usually the passenger is the one who's firing because they're not focused on driving.
Can't make out the license plate.
With no more leads from the CCTV, police track down one of KJ's friends, seen running away from the scene.
Thank you for coming in. I'm Detective Hill. This is Detective Marsh.
He was brought into the Criminal Investigation Division. He was very upset. He and KJ were friends. He was traumatized.
We want to know, has KJ had any problems with anybody?
Do you know who shot KJ?
No. Everyone loved him.
He said he didn't have any problems with anybody. He didn't have any enemies. He said that he was at the 2nd Avenue Center, which is a community center, there a couple blocks away, playing basketball and hanging out with KJ and some other friends. Maybe something happened there. Maybe something happened while they were playing basketball. Maybe something happened while they were riding dirt bikes in the street. It could be somebody that they knew that they got in an argument with, or it could be a complete stranger.
Detective Hill retrieves the security footage from the community center to see if anything occurred prior to the shooting.
Can you start at 6:50 p.m.? Okay, play it from there. There they are.
They were just hanging out, having fun, talking to friends, riding their dirt bikes up and down the street, just having a normal evening.
Rewind. Okay, play it from there.
There's some people in vehicles. There are some other people just kind of gathered around. Everything seems fine.
Scroll it on, please. Okay, play it from there.
They're starting to load up on their bikes to leave. And next thing you know, I see the suspect vehicle passing them.
There's the truck.
Immediately passes them, kind of swerves around them. Hits his brakes and turns up a street.
Can you switch to the second camera? Rewind. Wait, play it from there. Freeze it. Looks like they're stalking them.
Watching the video became obvious that KJ and his friends had no idea. They had no idea that this truck was following them. They had no idea that what was to come.
Detective Hill still has no information on the truck.
Freeze it. Zoom in. It's no use. Can't make out the license plate.
Detective Hill returns to the community center and retraces the path the truck traveled before passing KJ.
We began just walking around the streets, seeing what we could see, and we found several cameras on some houses.
Good afternoon, sir. Detective Hill. Is your camera working?
We have this one residence that's pointing kind of towards 2nd Avenue.
Can you cue it up to 7:50 p.m.?
And all of a sudden, there it goes. The suspect vehicle comes up the street and turns right on 2nd Avenue.
Rewind. Can you go frame by frame?
I see it's a Ford F-150. And then I start also seeing other things that kind of break it down to make it a little bit more identifiable.
Freeze that.
Social media, anywhere we could just to get it out there to maybe we can get some kind of tip or some lead to follow up on.
As the hunt for the killer continues, Kelvin Taylor's funeral takes place.
It was held in the Vicks Coliseum in Charleston.
It was just so many people. It was overwhelming.
Mayor, police chief, I believe, a couple pastors, high school coaches, friends, family, people that we didn't know that he impacted himself.
The outpour the people gave to me and my husband was unreal.
I try not to cry, but the tears flow down my face. But just to see everybody show up and support their family and him, well, it was amazing. It gave people a sense of like, we got to stick together. But when you look in the front, you see KJ in the casket. It tears you apart.
But if it wasn't for that outpour, we probably wouldn't know where we would be at right now.
That Sunday, I came into the office and I noticed that I had gotten a voicemail.
1:37 p.m.
And it was the individual saying that they believed that they were the owner of the vehicle that we had released to the media. So I immediately contacted them.
She was able to provide a description of the vehicle with the make and model.
You sold it to who?
They told me that they were the owner of the truck, but they had sold it months prior.
Do you know who has it now?
Try to get as much information as I can about that person. We got to track them down.
That's great. Thank you, ma'am.
Detectives stake out the address of the person said to be the new owner, but there's no sign of the truck.
I get a phone call from the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office. They had just received a call from an anonymous tip saying that the suspect vehicle was parked in between some trailers up in an area called Hall's Drive. I immediately began traveling to Hall's Drive. We pull up, and I see it for the first time. A silver and gray two-tone Ford F-150.
They were able to seize that vehicle to allow an opportunity to get a search warrant to later search that vehicle.
Efforts to follow up on the original owner's lead hit a dead end.
Hill speaking.
But investigators receive an anonymous tip linking the vehicle to a man named Dakotas. Detective Hill has heard the name before.
Thanks for letting me know.
Dakotas Thomas. His name had been brought up several times with the Charleston Police Department. He was always just on our radar, and I knew that he was a violent guy, he was a dangerous guy. We needed to check it to see if it's Dakotas Thomas driving the truck.
The license plates have been removed, but Detective Hill finds the truck's unique vehicle identification number.
I took the VIN number from the truck and placed it in our database. I learned that The truck had actually got an oil change on April 7th, which was the day of the homicide. I need to go to the garage where the oil change was done at and see what I can find out.
Do your cameras work?
I spoke with employees there who were able to print me out a receipt, which gave me the time of the oil change.
It was somewhere around 2:30 in the afternoon when the oil was changed in the truck.
Can you play it from 2:30 p.m., please?
We began watching the surveillance video. We're looking for who's in that truck.
Look, freeze it. Rewind. Play it again.
I see the truck pull in. I can't make out any faces.
Can you switch to the interior camera?
It showed the truck there, but it did not show the passenger that well.
When you're seeing the red shirt, the same as the video footage from Andrew's Flooring and Hardware.
The passenger may be obscured,
Can you switch to the second camera?
but the driver, wearing a white t-shirt, is clearly visible.
Which is, again, like that video footage from Andrew's Flooring.
Look, zoom in.
As soon as I saw that, I saw his face, I was through the roof ecstatic.
The person driving the vehicle was Dakota Thomas. Being able to put a face to this crime was very important. We knew at that point that we had at least one of the suspects identified, one of the people that were involved in this murder identified.
To find the shooter in the passenger seat. First, we needed to capture Dakota Thomas.
Police find the details of Dakota Thomas's last known address, a trailer in Poker, Putnam County.
I obtained a search warrant for the trailer. We made an approach on the trailer. Your adrenaline's up. You never know what you're going to experience. You never know what you're going to find. Your senses are heightened.
This guy's certainly considered armed and dangerous.
We made our approach on the trailer, made entry into it.
All clear, guys?
We did not locate anybody inside. During our search, we located a red hooded sweatshirt. There was a burn mark in the lower back part. I was like, hey, this could be something.
With Dakota seen wearing a white t-shirt, the red hoodie could belong to the passenger and suspected shooter, whose identity remains unconfirmed.
The next morning, it began processing the interior, which is taking DNA swabs from the door handles, the steering wheel, from the F-150 pickup truck.
During the search of that vehicle, it was noted that there was a particular burn mark in the passenger seat. That red shirt showed a burn mark that would have lined up with the burn mark in the seat of the truck. Law enforcement officers believed at that time that a shell casing had been ejected from the firearm and fallen behind the individual that was in the passenger seat.
And as I'm looking at the burn mark, I noticed in between the crack of the seat, between like the back of the seat and where I actually sit down at, I see a bullet fragment. So I started looking around inside the truck, and I noticed that the B pillar, which is like where the door meets the truck, that it had been struck by a bullet.
It would have been impossible for the passenger to be able to have caused that type of damage.
And after seeing that, I knew that it had to be the driver that fired the shots at KJ.
The driver and the shooter involved in this murder was Dakotas Thomas. Dakotas Thomas became public enemy number one.
A warrant was executed to allow those officers to what we call ping his cell phone. They were able to pull information from both before and after the shooting.
Through his cell phone records, we learned that after he was in the area where he dropped the truck off of, he immediately appeared to flee toward Ohio.
There was a reward that was placed for anyone who could provide information of the whereabouts of Dakotas Thomas. But it felt there were a lot of people that refused to talk to the police.
KJ was killed in April, and it went all the way to August.
Finally, law enforcement officers received a tip from an individual who knew the whereabouts of Dakotas Thomas.
We kind of narrowed it down to an address in Akron, Ohio area.
That is when the U.S. Marshal Task Force closed in.
Notice, it's the U.S. Marshal!
He was a murderer. We all knew there was a significant concern for what he might do.
We needed to get him off the street.
I don't think any of us ever imagined what he would really do next.
People do crazy things trying to avoid capture. You know, they don't want to spend the rest of their lives in jail.
That encounter turned violent. It turned volatile, which is quite the understatement. He barricaded himself in and began throwing Molotov cocktails at the U.S. Marshal. Unfortunately for Dakotas, one of those cocktails didn't make it outside and set the house on fire that he had barricaded himself in.
So now he's in a bit of a pickle.
He attempts to escape through a window, eventually ends up on the roof of this residence.
At that point, he gave up, and the local fire department came with their ladders, got him off of the roof, and the marshals were able to take him into custody.
Once I got the phone call that they had Dakotas Thomas in custody and actually got a picture of him in handcuffs sitting in the back of a police car, after all the hard work, all the long nights, all the long days of watching video, talking to people, everything that led up to this moment, I was so excited. I knew we had him.
Dakotas Thomas is found guilty of the murder of KJ Taylor, and on December 2nd, 2022, is sentenced to life without parole. Dakotas Thomas admits he was targeting one of KJ Taylor's friends over a disagreement.
The video is telling us what happened. They played basketball. They were just hanging out, having fun, just having a normal evening. AJ and his friends had no idea that this truck was following them. They had no idea that what was to come.
Curtis Thomas was reckless enough to discharge a weapon from a moving vehicle in a very crowded area.
And KJ Taylor was the one who was hit.
We watched that video probably hundreds of times, and every time that we watched it, we hoped that it wasn't going to happen that time. We hoped that he wasn't going to get shot that time, but of course that's what the video showed.
I never really understood how big of a role video surveillance plays until this case.
That footage is really what blew the case open. That footage is what gave us the truck so that we could go from there and try to figure out who it was that had done the shooting.
I do not believe that law enforcement officers would have been able to solve this crime in the absence of video footage.
KJ Taylor was a son. He was a friend to a lot of people. He was a mentor to a lot of...
To keep going.
Minneapolis 911.
I heard gunshot. I'm so scared.
Why did it happen? Why are they dead?
We've got to solve this.
The unfortunate thing for you, there's too much video.
If we discovered a body,
It's easily the most brutal attack I've seen on another human.
we have to find out who committed this horrific act.
We have been kidnapped.
They had been held hostage.
It just broke my heart to think that she was that afraid.
There were calls about an object floating in the water.
The body was thrown out like trash in the bay.
This footage was the smoking gun.
We have a serial bomber. Oh my God, how many police did we just lose?
In a place like Wahiawa, the idea of violence does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with sirens echoing through crowded streets or with the visible tension of a city accustomed to crime. Instead, it exists in the quiet margins, in the spaces where routines repeat themselves day after day, and where familiarity creates the illusion of safety. Wahiawa is the kind of town where people recognize each other without needing introductions, where daily life follows predictable rhythms, and where the boundaries between public and private feel clearly defined. It is a place where danger is expected to come from outside, if it comes at all. But the reality of this case does not follow that expectation. It begins not with an intrusion, but with an absence of intrusion. There is no sign of forced entry, no indication that someone crossed a threshold uninvited. The walls that enclosed the home did not fail. The doors did not break. Whatever happened inside occurred within a space that remained physically intact, undisturbed by any external force. And that is where the unease begins, because it shifts the focus inward, toward the relationships contained within that space, toward the interactions that took place behind closed doors where no one else could see. When the incident was first discovered, it did not present itself as a mystery in the traditional sense. There was no question about whether a crime had occurred. The evidence made that clear. A life had ended, and it had not ended by accident. The signs of violence were present, unmistakable and immediate. What was less clear, however, was how that violence had unfolded and, more importantly, how it had reached the point where it could no longer be contained. In many cases, investigators begin by looking outward, searching for unfamiliar elements, disruptions to the normal order, strangers who do not belong. Here, that approach offered no direction. There were no unknown figures to pursue, no external threats to identify. The framework of the investigation had to be inverted almost immediately. Instead of asking who entered the space, The question became who was already inside and what had been happening long before the final moment occurred. The absence of an external threat does not simplify a case. In some ways, it makes it more difficult to understand. When violence originates from outside, it can often be traced through movement, through entry and exit, through observable disruption. When it originates within, it is embedded in the fabric of everyday life, hidden in interactions that may appear ordinary on the surface. It develops gradually, often without a single defining moment that marks its beginning. And by the time it becomes visible, it is already too late to interrupt. This is what gives the case its particular weight. It is not defined by a sudden act, but by a process that likely unfolded over time, a sequence of tensions and unresolved conflicts that accumulated beneath the surface of routine life. From the outside, nothing may have seemed out of place. The structure of daily living remained intact. The environment did not signal danger. And yet, within that structure, something was shifting, something was building toward a point that would ultimately become irreversible. There is a tendency to think of violence as an event, as something that happens at a specific moment, confined to a particular place. But in situations like this, that perspective is incomplete. The final act is only the visible endpoint of a much longer trajectory, one that is not always documented, not always understood, and often impossible to reconstruct in full. What can be observed is the outcome. What cannot be fully recovered is the sequence of internal changes that made that outcome possible. In Wahiawa, that trajectory remained largely invisible. The community surrounding the incident did not provide clear indicators of what had been developing within the home. There were no external signals strong enough to trigger intervention, no singular event that drew attention before the fact. The case, therefore, forces a confrontation with a difficult reality, that proximity does not guarantee awareness, and that even within close-knit environments, certain forms of tension can persist without detection. As the initial details emerged, the framework of the case became increasingly defined by what was not present. There was no evidence of a break-in. There was no indication of random targeting. There was no external motive that could be easily identified. Each of these absences narrowed the scope of interpretation, directing attention toward the relationships that existed within the household itself. But even as the focus shifted inward, clarity did not immediately follow. Understanding violence within a family context requires a different kind of analysis. It is not enough to identify who was involved. It becomes necessary to examine how those individuals interacted over time, how conflicts developed, how they were managed or left unresolved. Yet, this kind of examination is inherently limited by the available evidence. Unlike physical traces at a crime scene, relational dynamics do not leave clear, measurable marks. They are inferred through behavior, through statements, through patterns that may or may not be fully visible. In this case, the early recognition that the incident was rooted in internal conflict did not resolve the underlying questions. It only redefined them. Instead of searching for a single cause, investigators were confronted with the possibility of multiple contributing factors, each interacting in ways that could not be easily separated or quantified. The simplicity of a single motive was replaced by the complexity of accumulated tension. The difficulty of this shift cannot be overstated. When a case lacks an external point of origin, it resists straightforward explanation. It requires an acknowledgement that the factors leading to the outcome may be diffuse, distributed across time and interaction rather than concentrated in a single event. This does not make the case less real or less urgent. If anything, it makes it more challenging to grasp because it does not conform to familiar patterns of cause and effect. As the investigation began to take shape, one thing became increasingly clear. The question was not whether the violence had occurred. The evidence had already answered that. The question was how a space defined by familiarity had become the site of that violence, and how the relationships within that space had evolved to a point where such an outcome could take place. There is no immediate answer to that question, and there may never be a complete one. What remains is the recognition that the conditions for violence do not always originate in visible disruption. Sometimes they are embedded in the ordinary, in interactions that appear manageable, in conflicts that seem containable. And sometimes, those conditions persist long enough and intensify enough that they produce an outcome that feels both sudden and inevitable at the same time. This is where the story begins, not with a clear sequence of events, but with a contradiction. A quiet town, a familiar environment, a space that should have been secure, and within it, an act that disrupts all of those expectations. There are no clear boundaries between before and after, no distinct moment where everything changes in a way that can be fully observed. Instead, there is only the aftermath and the attempt to understand how it came to be. The case in Wahiawa does not offer immediate clarity. It does not provide the kind of narrative that unfolds in a straight line from cause to effect. What it offers instead is a set of conditions, a context in which something developed over time, unseen and unaddressed, until it could no longer remain contained. And in that sense, the most unsettling aspect of the case is not just the violence itself, but the realization that it emerged from within a structure that appeared, from the outside, to be entirely intact. The town of Wahiawa sits in a part of Oahu that does not demand attention. It is not defined by the intensity of a major city, nor by the isolation of a remote landscape. Instead, it exists in a steady middle ground, where daily life follows patterns that feel both ordinary and dependable. The streets carry a sense of routine, shaped by people who have lived there long enough to recognize the rhythm of their surroundings without needing to think about it. In this environment, familiarity becomes its own kind of structure, a quiet agreement that life will continue in ways that are predictable, manageable, and largely undisturbed. Within that setting, the idea of a family home carries a specific weight. It is assumed to be a place where boundaries are clear, where relationships, even when strained, remain contained within a framework of shared living. The home is not just a physical space, but a system of interactions, a network of routines and expectations that define how individuals coexist. Meals, conversations, silences, disagreements, all of these become part of a pattern that, from the outside, appears stable simply because it persists over time. In the case of this family, that external perception of stability did not immediately suggest anything unusual. There were no clear indicators that distinguished the household from others in the same area. It was part of the same community structure, subject to the same environmental influences, embedded in the same social context. Yet, as later investigation would reveal, the internal dynamics of the family did not align perfectly with the outward appearance of normalcy. Beneath the surface, there were tensions that had developed gradually, shaped by interactions that were not always visible or understood by those outside the household. These tensions were not described as sudden or unexpected. Instead, they appeared to be part of an ongoing pattern, a series of unresolved conflicts that accumulated over time. This accumulation is important because it suggests that the eventual outcome was not the result of a single moment of instability, but rather the product of a sustained process. Each interaction, each disagreement, each instance of pressure that was not fully resolved contributed to a larger structure of strain that existed within the family environment. The nature of these tensions was rooted in personal relationships. They did not originate from external threats or outside interference. There was no indication of criminal influence entering the household from beyond its boundaries. Instead, the conflicts were internal, arising from the interactions between individuals who shared the same space, the same routines, and, to a certain extent, the same constraints. This internal origin is what defines the case at its core, because it shifts the focus away from external causation and toward the complexities of human relationships in close proximity. Financial elements were also present within this environment, but not in a way that could be easily quantified or documented. Rather than formal transactions or clearly recorded disputes, the financial dimension existed as part of the broader relational context. It contributed to the overall tension, adding another layer of pressure that interacted with existing interpersonal dynamics. However, like many aspects of the case, this element remained difficult to isolate or measure with precision, existing instead as a contributing factor rather than a clearly defined cause. Psychological pressure played a similar role. Living within a confined relational structure, where conflicts are repeated and not fully resolved, can create a cumulative effect. Over time, this effect can alter how individuals perceive each other, how they interpret behavior, and how they respond to stress. In the absence of resolution, tension does not dissipate. It persists, often becoming more complex as it interacts with new circumstances and additional sources of strain. This creates an environment where the threshold for escalation may gradually lower, even if that change is not immediately visible. From the outside, however, these internal shifts are rarely observable. The community surrounding the family did not provide clear evidence of the tensions that were developing. There were no definitive signals that could have prompted early intervention or even heightened awareness. This lack of external visibility is a defining feature of many cases involving internal conflict. It highlights the limitations of observation in environments where the most significant dynamics occur behind closed doors, within spaces that are not subject to constant external scrutiny. The family structure itself becomes both the context and the constraint. It defines the relationships in which conflict occurs, but it also limits the ways in which that conflict can be expressed or resolved. In such a system, individuals are not easily removed from the environment, and interactions are repeated over time, often without the opportunity for complete separation. This repetition can reinforce existing patterns, making it more difficult to break cycles of tension once they have been established. Understanding this context is essential because it frames the incident not as an isolated event, but as the culmination of a broader set of conditions. The family environment did not suddenly become unstable. It evolved in that direction, shaped by factors that were present long before the final moment occurred. Each unresolved issue, each instance of strain that was not fully addressed, contributed incrementally to a larger structure that eventually reached a critical point. The difficulty lies in identifying that point with precision. Unlike physical evidence, which can often be traced to a specific time and place, relational dynamics do not offer clear markers of transition. There is no single moment that can be definitively labeled as the beginning of the end. Instead, there is a gradual shift, a movement from manageable tension to something more severe, a progression that may only become visible in retrospect. This retrospective understanding is inherently limited. It relies on reconstructing patterns from incomplete information, on interpreting interactions that were not fully documented, and on inferring meaning from behaviors that may have had multiple interpretations at the time they occurred. As a result, the portrait of the family and its internal dynamics remains necessarily partial, shaped as much by what cannot be known as by what can be observed. What emerges from this partial understanding is a picture of a system under pressure. A household where relationships carried weight beyond simple coexistence, where interactions were influenced by factors that extended beyond the immediate moment, and where tension was not an anomaly, but a recurring element of daily life. This does not reduce the complexity of the case. If anything, it emphasizes it because it demonstrates how ordinary structures can contain extraordinary strain without revealing it outwardly. In Wahiawa, the broader environment continued to function as expected. The routines of the community did not change, the external world remained consistent, and the contrast between that stability and the internal dynamics of the family became more pronounced. It is within that contrast that the case takes shape, defined not by what was visible, but by what remained hidden until it could no longer be contained. The portrait of the victim, within this context, is inseparable from the environment in which they lived. Their presence was part of the same relational system, subject to the same pressures, influenced by the same interactions. Understanding their experience requires understanding that system, not as a static backdrop, but as an active set of conditions that shaped the course of events. It is within this framework that the story moves forward, from context into incident, from the gradual accumulation of tension into the moment where that tension finally breaks. The moment when the incident in Wahiawa moved from private tension into irreversible reality did not arrive with the clarity that many expect from violent events. There was no singular, clearly documented sequence that could be followed step by step, no complete timeline that would allow investigators to reconstruct each action with certainty. Instead, What exists is a fragmented understanding, shaped by the physical evidence that remained and the limitations imposed by the absence of direct witnesses. The event itself unfolded within a confined space, contained entirely within the boundaries of a family environment, and because of that, much of what occurred in those final moments remains beyond full recovery. What is known begins with the discovery. The victim was found deceased, and the condition of the scene immediately ruled out the possibility of an accidental death. The presence of violence was not subtle. It was evident in a way that left little room for alternative interpretations. This was not a situation that required prolonged analysis to determine whether a crime had taken place. The reality of that crime was apparent from the outset. Yet, even as that clarity emerged, it did not bring with it an understanding of how the situation had escalated to that point. The environment in which the incident occurred provided important context. There were no signs of forced entry, no indications that an unknown individual had entered the space. The physical boundaries of the home remained intact, reinforcing the conclusion that the individuals involved were already inside. This absence of intrusion narrowed the scope of the event, focusing attention on the relationships within the household. It suggested that whatever conflict had occurred did so between people who shared familiarity, who occupied the same environment not as strangers, but as participants in an ongoing set of interactions. Within that confined setting, the progression from tension to violence cannot be mapped with precision. There is no verified sequence that identifies who initiated the confrontation, how the situation evolved from verbal or emotional conflict into physical harm, or how long the escalation lasted before it reached its fatal conclusion. These gaps are not the result of oversight but of inherent limitation. Without independent witnesses or comprehensive recording of events, the internal dynamics of the incident remain partially obscured, accessible only through inference rather than direct observation. What can be inferred, however, aligns with the broader context established prior to the incident. The presence of ongoing tension within the family suggests that the event did not emerge spontaneously. Instead, it likely developed from an existing foundation of unresolved conflict. In such situations, escalation does not always follow a predictable pattern. It may occur gradually, with each interaction contributing incrementally to a growing sense of strain, or it may intensify rapidly once a certain threshold is reached. Without a detailed timeline, it is impossible to determine which of these patterns applies in this case, but the existence of prior tension indicates that the conditions for escalation were already in place. The physical evidence at the scene confirms that the incident involved direct interpersonal violence. This is not consistent with accidental harm or indirect causes. It reflects an interaction in which force was applied intentionally within the immediate proximity of those involved. The confined nature of the environment further emphasizes this point, as it limits the number of variables that could have influenced the outcome. There were no external factors intervening at the moment of the incident, no outside interference altering the course of events. What occurred was the result of interactions contained entirely within the household. Despite this, the exact nature of those interactions remains uncertain. The absence of a detailed sequence leaves open multiple possibilities regarding how the confrontation began and how it progressed. It is not possible to definitively identify the initial trigger, the specific exchange that marked the transition from tension to violence. This uncertainty is a defining characteristic of the case, and it underscores the difficulty of reconstructing events that occur in private spaces without external observation. The lack of clarity extends to the duration of the incident. Without precise timing, it cannot be determined whether the escalation was brief or prolonged, whether it unfolded over minutes or over a longer period. This temporal ambiguity affects how the event is understood, because duration can influence the interpretation of intent, response, and opportunity for de-escalation. In the absence of that information, the incident must be viewed as a single, continuous event without clearly defined stages. What is clear is that the outcome was irreversible. The victim's death marked the end of the escalation, the point at which the accumulated tension within the household translated into a final, tangible consequence. This transition from internal conflict to external reality is central to understanding the case. It represents the moment when dynamics that had previously been contained within relationships became visible through their effects. The scene itself, while providing confirmation of violence, does not offer a complete narrative. Physical evidence can indicate what occurred in a general sense, but it cannot fully capture the sequence of decisions, reactions, and interactions that led to the final outcome. It does not reveal the internal states of those involved, the perceptions and emotions that may have influenced their behavior. These elements remain inaccessible, contributing to the overall incompleteness of the reconstruction. In many cases, investigators rely on witness testimony to fill these gaps, to provide context that physical evidence alone cannot supply. Here, that resource was not available. The absence of independent witnesses means that there is no external perspective to corroborate or clarify the sequence of events. This absence reinforces the isolation of the incident, emphasizing that it occurred entirely within a closed system, without external observation or intervention. This isolation has broader implications for how the case is understood. It highlights the limitations of investigative methods when applied to events that occur in private, where the available evidence is inherently constrained. It also underscores the importance of context, of understanding the conditions that existed prior to the incident, even when those conditions cannot be fully documented. In the absence of a complete timeline, the broader pattern of tension becomes a key element in interpreting the event. The incident in Wahiawa, therefore, cannot be reduced to a simple sequence of actions. It must be viewed as the culmination of a process, one that began long before the final moment and that unfolded in ways that were not fully visible from the outside. The lack of detailed reconstruction does not diminish the significance of the event. Instead, it emphasizes the complexity of situations where internal dynamics play a central role. As the investigation moved forward, this complexity became an unavoidable part of the case. The focus shifted from attempting to reconstruct every detail of the incident to understanding the broader conditions that made it possible. This shift does not resolve the uncertainties, but it provides a framework for interpreting them. It acknowledges that not all aspects of the event can be known, while still recognizing the factors that contributed to its occurrence. The incident itself remains, in many ways, an incomplete narrative. It is defined by what can be confirmed, shaped by what can be inferred, and limited by what cannot be recovered. Within those constraints, it stands as a moment where internal conflict, long present and largely unseen, reached a point where it could no longer remain contained, transforming into an act of violence that altered the course of everything that followed. The investigation into the incident in Wahiawa began with a framework that was both clear and constrained. From the outset, authorities did not need to determine whether a crime had occurred. The evidence at the scene had already established that conclusion. What remained uncertain, however, was the structure of the event itself, the sequence of interactions that led from ongoing tension to irreversible violence. This distinction shaped every step of the investigative process, narrowing its scope while simultaneously deepening its complexity. Unlike cases that begin with unknown suspects or external threats, this investigation immediately centered on a defined group of individuals. The absence of forced entry and the lack of indications of an outside presence directed attention inward, toward those who had direct access to the environment in which the incident occurred. This internal focus simplified certain aspects of the investigation by limiting the number of potential participants, but it also introduced a different kind of difficulty. When all individuals involved are connected through close relationships, the lines between witness, participant, and observer become less distinct. The first stage of the investigation involved establishing a baseline understanding of the relationships within the household. Investigators sought to determine how the individuals involved were connected, how they interacted on a daily basis, and whether there were identifiable patterns of conflict. This process relied heavily on available statements, both from those directly involved and from any peripheral sources who might have had insight into the family dynamics. However, even at this early stage, limitations began to emerge. The information gathered did not always align in a consistent or complete manner, reflecting the inherent difficulty of reconstructing private interactions through retrospective accounts. As the investigation progressed, It became increasingly clear that tension within the household was not an isolated occurrence. There were indications of ongoing conflict, of interactions that had been strained over time rather than defined by a single triggering event. This recognition was significant because it shifted the investigative focus from identifying a singular cause to understanding a pattern. Instead of searching for one moment that could explain the outcome, investigators had to consider the cumulative effect of repeated interactions, each contributing incrementally to the overall dynamic. This shift in focus, however, did not resolve the central challenge of the case. Understanding that tension existed does not provide a detailed account of how that tension escalated into violence. The investigation required not only the identification of contributing factors, but also an attempt to map how those factors interacted in the moments leading up to the incident. Without a clear timeline or independent verification, this mapping remained incomplete. The available evidence could suggest possibilities, but it could not confirm a definitive sequence. Statements collected during the investigation played a critical role, but they also introduced additional complexity. Accounts of events were not always consistent, and in some instances, they lacked sufficient detail to establish a coherent narrative. This inconsistency is not unusual in cases involving close relationships, where perspectives may differ based on individual experience, perception, and emotional involvement. However, it complicates the process of verification, as discrepancies must be evaluated without the benefit of objective reference points. The absence of independent witnesses further intensified this difficulty. In cases where events occur in public or semi-public spaces, external observation can provide a level of confirmation that helps anchor the investigation. Here, that element was entirely missing. The incident unfolded within a private environment, and as a result, there were no external perspectives to corroborate or challenge the accounts provided by those involved. This lack of external validation meant that investigators had to rely more heavily on internal consistency and the alignment between statements and physical evidence. Physical evidence, while crucial, offered only partial clarity. It confirmed the presence of violence and supported the conclusion that the incident was not accidental. However, it did not provide a complete reconstruction of the sequence of events. Physical traces can indicate that certain actions occurred, but they do not always reveal the order in which those actions took place or the context in which they were initiated. In this case, the evidence established the outcome, but did not fully illuminate the process. One of the central challenges of the investigation was the inability to establish a precise timeline. Without clear markers of when specific actions occurred, it was difficult to determine the progression of the incident. This temporal uncertainty affected multiple aspects of the case, from the interpretation of intent to the evaluation of responses. It limited the ability to distinguish between different phases of the event, effectively compressing what may have been a series of interactions into a single, undifferentiated occurrence. This compression has significant implications. It reduces the granularity of the narrative, making it harder to identify points at which the situation might have changed direction or escalated. It also complicates the assessment of individual actions, as those actions cannot be placed within a clearly defined sequence. Without that sequence, the relationships between cause and effect become less distinct, and the overall structure of the event remains partially obscured. Despite these limitations, the investigation did reach certain conclusions. It established that the incident was rooted in internal conflict, that it involved individuals within the same household, and that it was the result of interactions rather than external interference. These conclusions provided a framework for understanding the case, even if they did not resolve every question. They allowed investigators to define the nature of the event, to categorize it within the broader context of domestic violence, and to focus on the factors that were most relevant to that context. However, the identification of a framework is not the same as the resolution of uncertainty. The investigation continued to be shaped by what could not be definitively determined. Questions remained about the specific triggers of the incident, the sequence of escalation, and the precise roles of those involved. These unresolved elements are not merely gaps in information. They are intrinsic to the nature of the case, reflecting the limitations of reconstructing events that occur within private, unobserved environments. As the investigative process moved forward, it became increasingly apparent that there would be no single turning point that clarified the entire situation. Instead, there were incremental developments, each contributing to a broader understanding without providing complete resolution. The recognition of ongoing tension, the analysis of inconsistent statements, and the interpretation of physical evidence all added layers to the case, but none of them alone could fully explain the transition from conflict to violence. This accumulation of partial insights defines the investigative narrative. It is not a story of sudden revelation, but of gradual approximation, an effort to approach understanding through the integration of incomplete and sometimes conflicting information. In this sense, the investigation mirrors the dynamics of the incident itself, both shaped by complexity, both resistant to simplification. In the end, the investigation into the Wahiawa case reveals as much about the limits of knowledge as it does about the facts of the incident. It demonstrates how even a clearly defined crime can remain partially opaque, how the absence of external observation and the presence of internal complexity can constrain the ability to reconstruct events with certainty. It also underscores the importance of context, of recognizing that the factors leading to violence are often embedded in patterns that extend beyond any single moment. What emerges is not a complete narrative, but a structured uncertainty, a framework within which certain elements are known and others remain unresolved. This framework does not eliminate the need for answers, but it defines the boundaries within which those answers can be sought. And within those boundaries, the case continues to exist, not as a fully resolved account, but as an ongoing effort to understand how internal conflict, left unaddressed, can evolve into something far more consequential. The transition from investigation to legal evaluation in the case from Wahiawa did not mark a shift from uncertainty to clarity, but rather a reorganization of the same limitations within a different framework. Where the investigative phase sought to understand what had happened, the legal process required those findings to be structured into arguments, interpretations, and conclusions that could withstand formal scrutiny. This shift did not introduce new facts so much as it imposed a new set of expectations on the existing ones, demanding coherence in a situation where coherence was inherently difficult to achieve. At its core, the case had already been defined as a homicide rooted in internal conflict. This classification established the legal foundation, confirming that the death was not accidental and that it resulted from deliberate interpersonal violence within a confined domestic environment. However, beyond this central determination, the details remained complex. The absence of a clear timeline, the lack of independent witnesses, and the inconsistencies in available statements all carried over into the legal phase, shaping how the case could be presented and evaluated. Legal proceedings rely on the ability to construct a narrative that is both logically consistent and supported by evidence. In cases where events can be reconstructed with precision, this process follows a relatively direct path. Evidence is introduced, timelines are established, and individual actions are placed within a sequence that can be analyzed and debated. In this case, however, that level of precision was not fully attainable. The narrative had to be built from fragments, from partial accounts and indirect indicators, each contributing to an overall picture that remained incomplete. One of the central challenges in this process was the interpretation of intent. In legal contexts, understanding intent is often crucial to determining the nature of a crime and the appropriate response to it. Yet intent cannot be directly observed. It must be inferred from actions, context, and available evidence. Without a clear sequence of events, inferring intent becomes more difficult, as the relationship between cause and effect is less clearly defined. This ambiguity does not eliminate the need for interpretation, but it complicates the basis on which that interpretation is made. The absence of independent witnesses further limited the scope of the legal narrative. In many cases, testimony from individuals who observed the event can provide critical context, helping to clarify actions and establish credibility. Here, that resource was not available. The accounts that existed were internal to the situation, shaped by the perspectives of those directly involved. This created a situation in which statements had to be evaluated not only for their content, but also for their consistency with each other and with the physical evidence. Consistency, however, was not always present. Differences in recollection, interpretation, and emphasis contributed to a body of statements that did not align perfectly. Such discrepancies are not uncommon, particularly in situations involving stress and emotional complexity, but they introduce additional layers of uncertainty. In a legal context, these inconsistencies must be addressed, either by reconciling them within a broader narrative or by assessing their impact on the credibility of the information presented. Physical evidence provided a more stable foundation, but it too had its limits. It confirmed that violence had occurred and supported the classification of the incident as a homicide. It indicated that the event took place within the household and that it involved direct interpersonal interaction. However, like in the investigative phase, it did not fully resolve the sequence of actions. It could not establish a precise order of events or identify a singular initiating moment. As a result, it functioned as a supporting element rather than a definitive account. Within this framework, the legal process became an exercise in balancing certainty and uncertainty. Certain aspects of the case were firmly established, while others remained open to interpretation. The challenge was not simply to present the known facts, but to integrate them in a way that allowed for a coherent understanding of the event, even in the absence of complete information. This required careful consideration of how each piece of evidence related to the others and how gaps in knowledge could be acknowledged without undermining the overall structure of the case. The role of motive also played a significant part in this process. The identification of ongoing internal conflict provided a basis for understanding why the incident might have occurred. It suggested that the violence was not random, but connected to existing tensions within the household. However, as with intent, motive cannot be directly measured. It must be inferred from patterns of behavior and contextual factors. In this case, those patterns were present, but not fully defined, contributing to a picture that was plausible but not exhaustively detailed. As the legal evaluation progressed, it became clear that the case would not yield a complete reconstruction of events. Instead, it would be resolved within the constraints of the available evidence, with conclusions drawn based on the balance of probabilities and the coherence of the narrative presented. This does not imply a lack of rigor, but rather an acknowledgement of the limitations inherent in the case. The legal system does not require absolute certainty in every detail, but it does require a level of consistency and support that allows for a reasoned conclusion. The outcome of the case, therefore, reflects both what was known and what could not be fully determined. It confirms the nature of the incident as a homicide linked to internal conflict, and it establishes accountability within that context. At the same time, it leaves certain questions unresolved, particularly those related to the precise sequence of events and the detailed progression of the incident. These unresolved elements do not negate the findings, but they remain part of the case's structure, shaping how it is understood even after the legal process has concluded. This duality is a defining feature of cases involving domestic violence and private environments. They often resist complete reconstruction, not because of a lack of effort, but because of the inherent limitations of the evidence available. The legal process must navigate these limitations, working within them to reach conclusions that are supported by what can be established, while acknowledging what cannot. In Wahiawa, the resolution of the case did not provide a fully detailed narrative of the event. It did not transform uncertainty into complete clarity. Instead, it offered a structured understanding, a framework within which the essential aspects of the incident were defined and addressed. This framework allows for accountability and recognition of the nature of the crime, even as it leaves certain elements open to interpretation. The outcome, in this sense, is both definitive and incomplete. It closes the case in a legal sense, establishing the essential facts and their implications, while preserving the complexity that characterized the incident from the beginning. It reflects the reality that not all events can be fully reconstructed, and that understanding can exist in degrees rather than absolutes. As the legal process concludes, what remains is a record shaped by both evidence and limitation, a narrative that captures the core of what occurred while acknowledging the boundaries of what can be known. Within those boundaries, the The case stands as an example of how internal conflict, when left unresolved, can lead to consequences that extend beyond the private sphere into the domain of law and public accountability. The aftermath of the case in Wahiawa does not unfold in a dramatic or highly visible way. There are no sweeping changes that alter the structure of the town, no immediate transformation that signals a clear division between before and after. Instead, the impact settles into the environment more quietly, diffused through awareness rather than spectacle. Life continues in its familiar patterns, but the understanding of what can exist within those patterns is altered in a way that is difficult to measure, but impossible to fully ignore. In communities like Wahiawa, where daily life is shaped by consistency and routine, the significance of such a case lies not only in what happened, but in what it reveals. The incident forces a reconsideration of assumptions that often go unchallenged, particularly the assumption that proximity equates to understanding, and that stability on the surface reflects stability beneath it. These assumptions are not dismantled all at once. Instead, they are gradually eroded by the recognition that something as serious as internal violence can develop without clear external indicators. For those who encounter the case after its conclusion, the absence of a fully detailed narrative becomes part of its lasting effect. There is no complete reconstruction that can be followed from beginning to end, no definitive account that resolves every question. This absence does not diminish the reality of the event, but it shapes how it is remembered. It leaves space for uncertainty, for the acknowledgement that some aspects of the incident remain beyond precise understanding. In that space, the case becomes less about a sequence of actions and more about the conditions that made those actions possible. One of the most enduring aspects of the case is its reflection of the limitations inherent in addressing internal conflict. The dynamics that existed within the household were not visible in a way that allowed for early intervention. They developed within a private environment, shaped by interactions that were not subject to continuous observation. This does not suggest that the outcome was inevitable, but it does highlight the difficulty of identifying risk when it is embedded in ordinary patterns of behavior. The absence of clear warning signs from an external perspective underscores the challenge of recognizing when tension has reached a critical level. The case also emphasizes the cumulative nature of unresolved conflict. Rather than being defined by a single moment of breakdown, it represents the result of pressures that built over time. Each unresolved issue contributed incrementally to a larger structure of strain, a structure that eventually exceeded its capacity to remain contained. This cumulative process is not unique to this case, but it is particularly evident here because of the lack of external interference. With no outside factor to disrupt or redirect the dynamic, the internal pressures were allowed to develop without interruption until they manifested in a decisive and irreversible way. From a broader perspective, the case highlights the limitations of investigative and legal systems when confronted with events that occur entirely within private spaces. These systems are designed to interpret evidence, to reconstruct events, and to establish accountability. They function most effectively when there is a combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and clearly defined sequences of action. When one or more of these elements is missing, as it was in this case, the ability to achieve complete clarity is reduced. This does not prevent the systems from reaching conclusions, but it does shape the nature of those conclusions, grounding them in what can be reasonably established rather than what can be definitively known. The absence of complete clarity also affects how the case is integrated into collective understanding. It resists simplification, resisting the kind of narrative that can be easily summarized or reduced to a single cause. Instead, it remains complex, defined by multiple contributing factors that interact in ways that are not fully transparent. This complexity can be unsettling because it challenges the expectation that events, especially serious ones, can be fully explained and understood. It suggests that there are limits to comprehension, particularly when dealing with the intricacies of human relationships. Within the context of domestic environments, this realization carries particular weight. The home is often regarded as a space of safety, a place where individuals are protected from external threats. When violence originates within that space, it disrupts that perception, introducing a different kind of vulnerability. It reveals that safety is not solely determined by physical boundaries, but also by the quality of the relationships contained within those boundaries. When those relationships are strained, the sense of security associated with the environment can be compromised, even if no external threat is present. The case in Wahiawa serves as a reminder of this distinction. It illustrates how the absence of external danger does not guarantee internal stability, and how the most significant risks can sometimes be those that are least visible. This does not lead to a simple conclusion or a straightforward lesson. Instead, it encourages a more nuanced understanding of how conflict develops and how it can be addressed before reaching a critical point. It suggests that awareness must extend beyond observable behavior to include the recognition of patterns that may not be immediately apparent. At the same time, the case does not offer a clear model for prevention. The factors involved are too diffuse, too embedded in the specifics of individual relationships to be easily generalized. What it provides instead is a perspective, a way of considering how internal dynamics can evolve and how they might be identified earlier, even if that identification is inherently uncertain. It underscores the importance of communication, of addressing conflict before it accumulates, while also acknowledging that such processes are complex and not always successful. For those who study or reflect on cases like this, the enduring impact lies in the questions that remain. Not questions about what happened in a specific sequence, but questions about how such situations develop and how they might be understood more effectively. These questions do not have simple answers, and they may not lead to definitive conclusions. But they are essential to the ongoing effort to understand the conditions under which violence occurs, particularly in environments that are otherwise considered stable. The story does not end with resolution. It continues in the way it is remembered, in the way it informs future perspectives, and in the way it shapes the understanding of similar situations. It becomes part of a broader narrative about the complexity of human interaction, about the ways in which conflict can persist and intensify, and about the limits of observation and intervention. In this sense, the case extends beyond its immediate context, contributing to a larger conversation about how society perceives and responds to internal forms of violence. In the end, what remains is not a complete account, but a structured awareness. The recognition that not all events can be fully reconstructed, that not all dynamics can be fully understood, and that even within environments that appear stable, there may exist conditions that challenge that stability in profound ways. The case in Wahiawa does not resolve these tensions. It brings them into focus, leaving behind a reminder that the most significant changes are not always visible as they occur, but only become apparent when their consequences can no longer be contained. There is a tendency, when looking back at cases like the one in Wahiawa, to search for a definitive lesson, something concrete that can be extracted and applied in a clear and direct way. It is a natural impulse, driven by the need to make sense of events that resist simple explanation. Yet, what defines this case is precisely its resistance to that kind of clarity. It does not offer a singular turning point that could have changed everything, nor does it present a sequence of warning signs that can be easily identified in hindsight. Instead, it exists as a layered example of how complexity, when left unaddressed, can evolve into something far more consequential than it initially appears. The difficulty begins with the nature of the conflict itself. Internal tensions, especially those within a family environment, rarely present themselves in ways that are immediately recognizable as dangerous. They are often embedded in everyday interactions, in disagreements that may seem manageable at the time, in patterns of communication that gradually shift without drawing explicit attention. These patterns can persist for extended periods, becoming normalized simply because they are repeated. Over time, what might once have been considered unusual becomes part of the expected structure of interaction, and in that normalization, the underlying strain becomes less visible, not more. This process of normalization is one of the most significant factors in understanding cases like this. When tension is repeated without resolution, it does not remain static. It changes form, becoming more complex as it interacts with additional stressors, whether those are emotional, psychological, or situational. The absence of resolution does not mean the absence of impact. Instead, It allows the impact to accumulate, to build in ways that are not always immediately perceptible. By the time the effects become visible, they are often already deeply embedded in the dynamics of the relationship. In Wahiawa, this accumulation appears to have followed that pattern. The available information indicates that the conflict within the household was not sudden, not the result of a single disagreement that escalated beyond control. It was something that developed over time, shaped by repeated interactions that did not lead to lasting resolution. This distinction is important because it challenges the assumption that extreme outcomes are always preceded by equally extreme indicators. In reality, the indicators may be subtle, distributed across time, and difficult to interpret without the benefit of hindsight. Hindsight itself, however, introduces its own complications. It allows patterns to be identified after the fact, but it does not necessarily clarify how those patterns appeared in real time. What seems obvious in retrospect may not have been visible to those experiencing it, particularly when the context is one of familiarity and routine. Individuals within the environment may perceive the situation differently, influenced by their own perspectives, expectations, and emotional states. This divergence in perception can further obscure the underlying dynamics, making it harder to recognize when a situation is approaching a critical point. Another aspect that emerges from this case is the role of isolation, not in a physical sense, but in a relational one. Even within a connected community, internal family dynamics can remain largely insulated from external observation. The presence of neighbors, acquaintances, or even extended social networks does not guarantee insight into what occurs within a household. This form of isolation is not necessarily intentional. It is often a byproduct of the boundaries that define private life, boundaries that are respected in most social contexts, but that can also limit the flow of information when problems arise. This limitation becomes particularly significant when considering the potential for intervention. Without clear indicators or external visibility, opportunities for early intervention are reduced. This does not imply that intervention is impossible, but it highlights the challenges involved in identifying when it is needed. The absence of overt signs does not equate to the absence of risk, but it complicates the process of recognizing that risk in time to address it effectively. The case also underscores the importance of understanding conflict as a process rather than an event. The final outcome, while definitive, represents only the endpoint of a much longer sequence. Focusing solely on that endpoint risks overlooking the factors that contributed to it, the gradual shifts that transformed manageable tension into something more severe. By examining the process, even within the limits of available information, it becomes possible to appreciate the cumulative nature of the dynamics involved and to recognize that the outcome was not an isolated occurrence, but the result of sustained interaction over time. At the same time, the case resists the idea that understanding the process leads to predictability. Even when patterns are identified, they do not translate into simple rules or reliable forecasts. Human behavior, particularly within close relationships, is influenced by a wide range of variables, many of which cannot be fully controlled or anticipated. This unpredictability is part of what makes cases like this so difficult to fully comprehend. It is also what prevents them from being reduced to straightforward explanations or solutions. What remains, then, is a form of awareness that is necessarily nuanced. It is an understanding that internal conflict can develop in ways that are not immediately visible, that resolution is not always achieved even when tension is recognized, and that the absence of external disruption does not guarantee internal stability. This awareness does not eliminate risk, but it provides a framework for thinking about how such situations might be approached, both in terms of recognition and response. The legacy of the case in Wahiawa is not defined by a single conclusion, but by the questions it continues to raise. How can internal conflict be identified before it reaches a critical point? What mechanisms exist for addressing tension within private environments where external observation is limited? To what extent can patterns of behavior be interpreted in ways that allow for meaningful intervention without overstepping the boundaries of privacy? These questions do not have simple answers, and they extend beyond the specifics of this case into broader considerations of social and relational dynamics. In reflecting on these questions, It becomes clear that the value of examining such cases lies not only in understanding what happened, but in exploring the conditions that made it possible. This exploration does not lead to definitive solutions, but it contributes to a deeper awareness of the complexities involved. It highlights the need for sensitivity in interpreting behavior, for attentiveness to patterns that may otherwise go unnoticed, and for a recognition that stability is not always as secure as it appears. Ultimately, the case serves as a reminder that the most significant changes often occur gradually, beneath the surface of ordinary life. They are not always accompanied by clear signals or dramatic shifts. Instead, they develop within the existing structure, shaped by interactions that may seem unremarkable in isolation but that, over time, create conditions that are anything but ordinary. When those conditions reach a breaking point, the outcome can appear sudden, even though the process that led to it was anything but. This is the paradox at the heart of the case in Wahiawa. It is both gradual and abrupt, both predictable in its pattern and unpredictable in its timing. It challenges the way events are typically understood, forcing a reconsideration of how conflict is perceived, how it develops, and how it might be addressed before it transforms into something irreversible. In examining the case from Wahiawa over time, what becomes increasingly evident is not a clearer picture of the incident itself, but a deeper understanding of the conditions that allow such incidents to emerge without warning. The passage of time does not fill in all the gaps left by the absence of direct evidence or consistent testimony. Instead, it reframes those gaps, turning them into points of reflection rather than obstacles to be overcome. The unanswered questions remain, but they begin to serve a different purpose, shaping how the case is interpreted rather than preventing interpretation altogether. One of the most persistent elements of the case is the contrast between visibility and reality. From the outside, the environment in which the incident occurred maintained the appearance of normalcy. The routines of daily life continued uninterrupted, and there were no overt signals that something within the household had reached a critical state. This disconnect between external perception and internal reality is not unique, but it is particularly pronounced here because of the absence of any clear transitional moment. There was no gradual shift that could be observed from the outside, no visible escalation that marked the movement from tension to crisis. This absence of observable transition raises important questions about how conflict is recognized and interpreted. In many situations, the identification of risk depends on the presence of visible indicators, changes in behavior that can be noted and understood within a broader context. When those indicators are subtle or absent, the ability to respond in a timely manner is significantly reduced. The case in Wahiawa illustrates this limitation with particular clarity, showing how internal dynamics can evolve independently of external observation, reaching a point of consequence without providing sufficient warning. At the same time, the case challenges the assumption that all significant events must have identifiable precursors. It suggests that while precursors may exist, they are not always accessible or interpretable in a way that allows for meaningful action. This does not negate their existence, but it complicates the process of identifying them in real time. It also highlights the role of interpretation, the ways in which individuals and communities make sense of behavior based on available information. When that information is incomplete or ambiguous, interpretation becomes uncertain, and the potential for misjudgment increases. The role of ambiguity is central to understanding the lasting impact of the case. Ambiguity does not simply reflect a lack of information. It shapes the entire framework within which the case is understood. It affects how evidence is evaluated, how conclusions are drawn, and how the narrative is constructed. In the absence of definitive answers, multiple interpretations may coexist, each supported by different aspects of the available information. This multiplicity does not necessarily lead to confusion, but it does prevent the case from being reduced to a single, definitive explanation. Within this context, the case becomes a study in limitation as much as it is a study in event. It demonstrates the boundaries of what can be known, particularly in situations where evidence is incomplete and perspectives are varied. These boundaries are not failures of the investigative or legal processes, but inherent aspects of the conditions under which those processes operate. Recognizing these boundaries is essential to understanding why certain questions remain unanswered and why those answers may not be recoverable even with continued analysis. Another dimension that emerges over time is the relationship between individual experience and collective understanding. For those directly involved, the incident represents a specific and immediate reality, shaped by personal interaction and direct consequence. For the broader community, and for those who examine the case later, it becomes something different, a narrative constructed from available information, interpreted through a wider lens. This shift from individual to collective perspective introduces additional layers of complexity, as the case is reinterpreted in different contexts, each bringing its own assumptions and frameworks. This process of reinterpretation does not alter the facts of the case, but it influences how those facts are understood. It allows the case to be integrated into broader discussions about internal conflict, domestic environments, and the limits of observation. In doing so, it extends the relevance of the case beyond its immediate circumstances, connecting it to larger patterns and themes that are not confined to a single location or moment in time. The specifics remain important, but they become part of a wider context in which similar dynamics can be recognized and examined. The passage of time also introduces a certain distance, not in terms of importance, but in terms of perspective. With distance comes the ability to view the case not only as an isolated incident, but as part of a continuum, a reflection of ongoing challenges in understanding and addressing internal conflict. This perspective does not resolve the uncertainties inherent in the case, but it situates them within a broader framework, allowing for a more comprehensive consideration of their implications. One of the key implications is the recognition that internal conflict cannot always be fully externalized or documented. It exists within relationships, shaped by interactions that are not always visible or measurable. This makes it inherently difficult to address through systems that rely on observable evidence and clearly defined events. The case in Wahiawa highlights this difficulty, showing how even a serious and consequential incident can emerge from dynamics that are largely hidden from view until it is too late to intervene. At the same time, the case underscores the importance of continuing to examine these dynamics, even when complete understanding is not possible. The absence of definitive answers does not diminish the value of inquiry. On the contrary, it emphasizes the need for ongoing attention to the factors that contribute to such incidents, even when those factors cannot be fully isolated or quantified. This attention is not about achieving perfect clarity, but about improving awareness, about recognizing patterns that might otherwise remain unnoticed. In this sense, the case functions as both a specific event and a broader point of reference. It provides a concrete example of how internal conflict can develop and manifest, while also illustrating the limitations of existing frameworks for understanding such development. It does not offer a solution, but it contributes to the ongoing process of refining how these issues are approached, both in theory and in practice. As the narrative of the case continues to exist over time, it does so not as a closed story, but as an open one, defined by both what is known and what remains uncertain. It invites reflection not only on the event itself, but on the processes by which events are understood, interpreted, and integrated into collective knowledge. It challenges the expectation that every story can be fully resolved, suggesting instead that some stories remain partially open, their significance shaped as much by their unanswered questions as by their confirmed details. In the end, the case from Wahiawa does not conclude with a sense of finality. It remains present as an example of complexity, of how internal dynamics can evolve in ways that are not fully visible or predictable. It stands as a reminder that understanding is often incomplete, that clarity has limits, and that within those limits, there is still value in examining, in questioning, and in acknowledging the depth of what cannot be entirely known. When a case like the one in Wahiawa continues to be examined long after its formal conclusion, it gradually shifts from being understood as a single event to being recognized as part of a broader pattern of human behavior and social limitation. The details remain rooted in a specific time and place, but their implications extend beyond those boundaries, prompting questions that are less about what happened in that particular instance and more about how similar circumstances might exist elsewhere, unnoticed and unresolved. This transition from specificity to generality does not diminish the importance of the original incident. On the contrary, it amplifies it because the case becomes a reference point, a way of thinking about situations that may not yet have reached a critical stage, but that share similar underlying dynamics. In this sense, the case functions as both a record and a warning, not in a dramatic or prescriptive way, but in a quiet, persistent manner that encourages deeper reflection rather than immediate reaction. One of the most significant aspects of this reflection is the recognition of how easily internal conflict can be compartmentalized. Within a household, tensions can exist in parallel with routine, each occupying its own space, without necessarily intersecting in a way that draws attention. Daily activities continue, responsibilities are maintained, and from an external perspective, the structure appears intact. This compartmentalization allows conflict to persist without disrupting the outward appearance of normalcy, creating a situation in which the underlying issues remain largely invisible. Over time, however, the separation between routine and conflict becomes increasingly fragile. The two begin to influence each other in subtle ways, altering patterns of interaction, affecting communication, and shaping emotional responses. These changes may not be immediately noticeable, particularly to those outside the environment, but they contribute to a gradual shift in the overall dynamic. The case in Wahiawa reflects this process, illustrating how the accumulation of unresolved issues can eventually reach a point where the separation can no longer be maintained. What makes this progression particularly challenging to address is the absence of a clear threshold, a moment at which the situation can be definitively identified as critical. Instead, the movement from stability to instability is gradual, marked by incremental changes that may not appear significant in isolation. This lack of a clear threshold complicates the process of intervention, as it requires not only the recognition of individual changes, but also an understanding of how those changes interact over time. The difficulty of recognizing such patterns is further compounded by the role of perception. Individuals within the environment may interpret events differently, influenced by their own experiences and expectations. What one person perceives as a manageable disagreement, another may experience as a source of significant stress. These differing perceptions can coexist without resolution, contributing to a dynamic in which the true extent of the conflict is not fully acknowledged by any single participant. This divergence in understanding can delay recognition of the problem, allowing it to develop further before it is addressed. In examining the case from a distance, it becomes clear that the absence of external indicators is not the same as the absence of internal complexity. The lack of visible disruption does not imply that the situation is stable. Rather, it suggests that the instability is contained within a context that limits its expression. This containment can be maintained for extended periods, but it is not necessarily sustainable indefinitely. When it eventually breaks down, the resulting event may appear sudden, even though it is the product of a long-term process. This realization has important implications for how similar situations are understood and approached. It suggests that reliance on visible indicators alone may not be sufficient for identifying risk, particularly in environments where privacy and routine mask underlying tension. It also highlights the importance of considering context, of looking beyond individual events to the patterns that connect them. This approach does not guarantee early detection, but it increases the likelihood of recognizing when a situation may require closer attention. At the same time, the case underscores the limits of such recognition. Even with a more nuanced understanding of how conflict develops, it remains difficult to predict when and how it will manifest in a critical way. Human behavior is influenced by a wide range of factors, many of which are not fully accessible or measurable. This unpredictability is not a flaw in the process of analysis, but an inherent aspect of the subject being analyzed. It means that while patterns can be identified, outcomes cannot be determined with certainty. This tension between pattern and unpredictability is central to the lasting significance of the case. It challenges the expectation that understanding leads to control, that identifying the factors involved will necessarily prevent similar outcomes in the future. Instead, it suggests a more limited but still meaningful form of understanding, one that acknowledges both the value and the boundaries of analysis. This understanding does not eliminate risk, but it provides a framework for thinking about how risk emerges and how it might be mitigated, even if it cannot be entirely avoided. Another dimension of the case that becomes more apparent over time is the role of silence, not only in the absence of witnesses or direct evidence, but in the broader sense of unspoken dynamics. Silence can function as a form of stability, maintaining the status quo by avoiding confrontation or disruption. However, it can also contribute to the persistence of unresolved issues, allowing them to remain unaddressed and to grow more complex over time. In the context of this case, silence is not merely a lack of information, but a condition that shapes how information is produced, shared, and understood. This understanding of silence extends beyond the immediate context of the case, offering insight into how similar dynamics may operate in other environments. It suggests that the absence of visible conflict does not necessarily indicate the presence of harmony, and that the lack of explicit communication may be as significant as overt disagreement. Recognizing this does not provide a simple solution, but it adds depth to the way such situations are interpreted, encouraging a more careful consideration of what is not immediately apparent. As the case continues to be reflected upon, it becomes less about the specific details of what occurred and more about the broader questions it raises. How can internal conflict be identified when it is not openly expressed? What role do perception and interpretation play in recognizing risk? How can systems designed to respond to clear events adapt to situations that develop gradually and without obvious indicators? These questions do not have definitive answers, but they remain relevant, shaping how similar cases are approached in the future. In this way, the case from Wahiawa retains its significance not because it provides closure, but because it resists it. It remains open, not in terms of its outcome, but in terms of its meaning. It invites continued examination, not to resolve what cannot be resolved, but to deepen the understanding of the conditions under which such events occur. It serves as a reminder that complexity is not something to be eliminated, but something to be acknowledged, and that within that acknowledgement lies the possibility of a more informed and attentive approach to the challenges it represents. As the case from Wahiawa continues to be revisited over time, it gradually takes on a different role, shifting from a singular incident anchored in a specific context to a broader lens through which patterns of human behavior are examined. The details of the event remain unchanged, but the perspective through which those details are viewed evolves, shaped by distance, reflection, and the accumulation of similar cases that echo its underlying dynamics. In this transformation, the case becomes less about reconstructing what happened and more about understanding how such situations come into existence in the first place. One of the most enduring aspects of this evolution is the recognition that internal conflict often exists in forms that are not immediately disruptive. It can coexist with routine, embedded within the structure of everyday life in a way that allows it to persist without drawing attention. This coexistence is not necessarily stable, but it can appear so from the outside, creating an impression of normalcy that masks the underlying tension. The case in Wahiawa illustrates how this masking effect can delay recognition, allowing conflict to develop over time without triggering external concern. This delay is not simply a matter of oversight. It is closely tied to the way in which people interpret behavior within familiar environments. When interactions occur within a known context, they are often understood in relation to that context, rather than as isolated indicators of potential risk. This contextual interpretation can make it more difficult to identify when a pattern of behavior deviates from what is sustainable, particularly when the deviation is gradual rather than abrupt. The familiarity of the environment can, in this sense, become a factor that obscures change rather than clarifying it. As the case is examined more deeply, it becomes clear that the absence of clear markers is one of its defining characteristics. There is no single moment that can be identified as the point at which the situation became critical. Instead, the progression is continuous, moving from one state to another without a clear boundary between them. This continuity challenges conventional approaches to understanding events, which often rely on the identification of discrete stages or turning points. In this instance, the lack of such markers requires a different approach, one that focuses on the accumulation of changes rather than their separation. The concept of accumulation is central to understanding how the dynamics in Wahiawa developed. Each interaction, each unresolved issue, contributed incrementally to a larger structure of tension. Individually, these contributions may not have appeared significant, but collectively they formed a pattern that could not be sustained indefinitely. The absence of resolution did not neutralize their impact. It allowed that impact to persist and to grow, shaping the environment in ways that were not immediately visible, but that were nonetheless consequential. This cumulative process also highlights the role of time, not as a neutral backdrop, but as an active element in the development of the situation. Over time, patterns become established, expectations are formed, and behaviors are reinforced. These temporal dynamics can make it more difficult to alter the course of a situation, as the established patterns create a form of inertia that resists change. In the context of this case, time did not resolve the conflict. It intensified it by allowing it to become more deeply embedded in the structure of interaction. Another important aspect of the case is the way in which it illustrates the limits of external understanding. Even with detailed analysis, the internal dynamics of a household cannot be fully reconstructed from the outside. There are always elements that remain inaccessible, shaped by personal experience and private interaction. This limitation does not invalidate the analysis, but it places boundaries on what can be known. It requires an acceptance that some aspects of the situation will remain beyond complete comprehension, no matter how thoroughly they are examined. This acceptance is not a form of resignation, but a recognition of the complexity inherent in human relationships. It acknowledges that not all variables can be controlled or predicted, and that understanding is often partial rather than complete. In the case of Wahiawa, this partial understanding is reflected in the way the narrative is constructed, with certain elements clearly defined and others remaining open to interpretation. This duality is not a flaw, but a characteristic of the conditions under which the case exists. The implications of this duality extend beyond the case itself. They inform how similar situations are approached, encouraging a perspective that is both attentive and cautious. Attentive, in the sense that it recognizes the importance of identifying patterns and understanding context. Cautious, in the sense that it acknowledges the limits of that understanding and avoids overconfidence in the ability to predict or control outcomes. This balanced perspective is essential for engaging with the complexity of internal conflict without oversimplifying it. As the case continues to be referenced and analyzed, it also contributes to a broader discourse on the nature of domestic environments. It challenges the assumption that such environments are inherently stable, highlighting the ways in which stability can be contingent on factors that are not immediately visible. It suggests that the perception of safety is not solely determined by external conditions, but also by the quality of internal relationships, which may not always align with that perception. This challenge does not lead to a simple redefinition of domestic spaces, but it introduces a more nuanced understanding of them. It recognizes that they are dynamic, shaped by ongoing interaction, and subject to change over time. This dynamic nature means that stability cannot be taken for granted, but must be understood as something that is maintained through continuous effort and effective communication. When those elements are lacking, the potential for instability increases, even if it is not immediately apparent. In reflecting on the case from Wahiawa, it becomes clear that its significance lies not in providing answers, but in framing questions. It does not resolve the complexities it presents, but it makes them visible, bringing attention to aspects of human interaction that are often overlooked. It encourages a deeper engagement with the factors that contribute to conflict, emphasizing the importance of context, perception, and time in shaping outcomes. Ultimately, the case serves as a reminder that understanding is an ongoing process, one that evolves as new perspectives are applied and as the context in which it is considered changes. It does not offer closure in the traditional sense, but it provides a foundation for continued reflection, a way of thinking about situations that are not easily defined or resolved. In this way, it remains relevant, not because it is fully understood, but because it continues to challenge the boundaries of understanding itself. Time. The case in Wahiawa begins to exist less as a singular narrative and more as a point of convergence for multiple lines of thought about conflict, perception, and the limits of intervention. It is no longer approached solely as an isolated incident, but as an example that intersects with broader questions about how individuals relate to one another within confined environments, and how those relationships can evolve in ways that are not immediately visible to the outside world. This shift does not alter the facts of the case, but it transforms the way those facts are engaged with, emphasizing interpretation over reconstruction. At the center of this evolving perspective is the recognition that understanding is often shaped as much by absence as by presence. In this case, what is missing plays a significant role in how the narrative is formed. The absence of independent witnesses, the lack of a clearly defined sequence of events, and the limited availability of direct evidence all contribute to a structure in which certain elements remain undefined. These gaps do not simply represent incomplete information. They actively shape the boundaries of interpretation, determining what can be concluded and what must remain open. This dynamic introduces a particular kind of tension into the process of analysis. On one hand, there is a desire to construct a coherent account, to bring together the available elements into a narrative that explains the outcome. On the other hand, there is an awareness that such coherence cannot be achieved without acknowledging the limits imposed by the missing pieces. The result is a narrative that is both structured and incomplete, one that provides a framework for understanding while leaving certain aspects unresolved. The presence of this tension highlights the role of uncertainty as an integral part of the case. Uncertainty is not merely a byproduct of missing information, it is a defining characteristic of the situation. It influences how evidence is interpreted, how conclusions are drawn, and how the case is ultimately understood. Rather than being eliminated, uncertainty must be managed, incorporated into the analysis in a way that allows for meaningful interpretation without overstating what can be known. In examining how this uncertainty operates, it becomes clear that it is closely tied to the nature of the environment in which the incident occurred. Domestic settings are inherently complex, shaped by ongoing interactions that are not easily observed or documented. These interactions create patterns that are meaningful within the context of the relationship, but that may not be readily accessible to external analysis. As a result, the internal dynamics of such environments often remain partially opaque, even when significant events bring them into focus. The case in Wahiawa exemplifies this opacity. The available information points to a history of internal conflict, to tensions that developed over time and that ultimately culminated in a violent outcome. However, the specific contours of that conflict, the precise ways in which it evolved and interacted with other factors, are not fully delineated. This lack of detail does not negate the existence of the conflict, but it limits the extent to which it can be fully understood from an external perspective. This limitation has important implications for how similar cases are approached. It suggests that efforts to understand internal conflict must account for the possibility that certain aspects will remain inaccessible, regardless of the depth of analysis. This does not diminish the value of investigation or interpretation, but it calls for a level of humility in the conclusions that are drawn. It requires an acknowledgement that understanding is often partial, and that this partiality is an inherent feature of the subject being examined. At the same time, the case underscores the importance of recognizing patterns even when they are not fully defined. The identification of ongoing tension, of unresolved issues that accumulate over time, provides a basis for understanding the broader dynamics at play. These patterns may not offer a complete explanation, but they contribute to a more nuanced perspective, one that situates the incident within a continuum rather than treating it as an isolated event. This perspective also emphasizes the role of context in shaping outcomes. The dynamics within the household did not exist in isolation. They were influenced by a range of factors, including individual experiences, relational expectations, and the broader environment in which they were situated. While these factors cannot be fully mapped, their presence is implicit in the development of the conflict, shaping its trajectory in ways that are not entirely visible, but that are nonetheless significant. In reflecting on these elements, it becomes clear that the case resists reduction to a single cause or explanation. It is defined by the interaction of multiple factors, each contributing to the overall dynamic in ways that are difficult to separate or quantify. This complexity is not an obstacle to understanding, but a characteristic of the situation that must be acknowledged and engaged with. It challenges the inclination to simplify, encouraging instead a more layered approach to interpretation. The implications of this layered approach extend beyond the case itself. They inform how internal conflict is conceptualized more broadly, highlighting the need to consider multiple dimensions rather than focusing on isolated factors. This includes not only the immediate interactions between individuals, but also the patterns that develop over time, the ways in which those patterns are reinforced or disrupted, and the conditions under which they may lead to critical outcomes. As the case continues to be revisited, it also raises questions about the role of external systems in addressing internal conflict. Investigative and legal frameworks are designed to respond to events that can be defined and documented, but they are less equipped to engage with dynamics that are diffuse and ongoing. This limitation does not reflect a failure of these systems, but rather the challenges inherent in applying structured processes to situations that do not conform to clear boundaries. This recognition does not lead to a simple solution, but it highlights the need for approaches that are sensitive to the complexity of the situations they seek to address. It suggests that understanding internal conflict requires not only the analysis of discrete events, but also an engagement with the broader context in which those events occur. This engagement must be flexible, capable of accommodating uncertainty and variation rather than relying solely on fixed categories and definitions. In the final analysis, the case in Wahiawa remains significant not because it provides definitive answers, but because it illuminates the conditions under which such answers are difficult to obtain. It brings attention to the interplay between visibility and invisibility, between what can be known and what remains beyond reach. It demonstrates how internal dynamics can evolve in ways that are not easily captured by external observation, and how those dynamics can have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate context. This enduring relevance is not tied to the resolution of the case, but to the questions it continues to provoke. It invites ongoing reflection, encouraging a deeper consideration of how conflict is understood and addressed. It challenges assumptions about stability and safety, prompting a more careful examination of the factors that contribute to both. And in doing so, it ensures that the case remains part of a larger conversation, one that extends beyond its specific details and into the broader realm of human experience. In the final consideration of the case from Wahiawa, what remains is not a complete reconstruction of events, but a layered understanding shaped by both what is known and what cannot be fully recovered. The passage of time has not dissolved the uncertainties that define the case from the beginning. Instead, it has given them a different kind of permanence, allowing them to exist alongside the established facts as integral components of the narrative rather than gaps waiting to be filled. This coexistence of clarity and ambiguity becomes the defining feature of how the case is ultimately understood. At its core, the case affirms a reality that is often difficult to confront, that significant harm can emerge from within environments that outwardly appear stable. The absence of external intrusion, the lack of random or opportunistic elements, and the concentration of the event within a domestic space all reinforce the conclusion that the origin of the incident was internal. This internal origin is not merely a factual detail, it is a central aspect of the case's meaning, shaping how it is interpreted and how its implications are considered in broader contexts. The understanding of internal conflict that emerges from this case is not one of sudden escalation, but of gradual development. The tensions that existed did not appear in a single moment, nor did they reach their critical point without preceding conditions. They were part of an ongoing dynamic, influenced by interactions that unfolded over time and that were not fully resolved. This temporal dimension is essential because it highlights the way in which unresolved issues can persist and accumulate, creating a structure of strain that may not be immediately visible, but that becomes increasingly significant as it develops. What makes this accumulation particularly difficult to address is the absence of clear external indicators. Without visible signs of disruption, the underlying dynamics remain largely contained within the environment in which they occur. This containment does not neutralize the conflict. It allows it to continue without interruption, shaping the interactions within the household in ways that may not be apparent to those outside it. The case demonstrates how such containment can persist until it is no longer sustainable, at which point the consequences become unavoidable. In reflecting on this process, it becomes clear that the limitations encountered in the investigation and legal evaluation are not separate from the nature of the incident itself. The same factors that obscured the development of the conflict also limited the ability to fully reconstruct it after the fact. The lack of independent witnesses, the absence of a precise timeline, and the inconsistencies in available statements all stem from the private and contained nature of the environment. These limitations are not incidental. They are directly connected to the conditions under which the event occurred. This connection underscores an important aspect of the case, that understanding is inherently constrained by context. The tools used to analyze events, whether investigative or legal, are designed to operate within certain parameters, relying on evidence that can be observed, documented, and verified. When those parameters are not fully met, the resulting understanding is necessarily partial. This does not invalidate the conclusions that are reached, but it shapes their scope, defining what can be confidently stated and what must remain open. The presence of these open elements does not diminish the significance of the case. On the contrary, it contributes to its enduring relevance because it highlights the boundaries of what can be known in situations involving complex human dynamics. It serves as a reminder that not all aspects of an event can be fully captured, and that some degree of uncertainty is an unavoidable part of the process of understanding. This recognition is not a limitation to be overcome, but a reality to be acknowledged. At the same time, the case provides a framework for considering how similar situations might be approached in the future. It emphasizes the importance of looking beyond isolated events to the patterns that precede them, of recognizing that significant outcomes often arise from processes that unfold over time. It suggests that attention to these processes, even when they are not fully visible, is essential for developing a more comprehensive understanding of how conflict evolves and how it might be addressed before reaching a critical stage. This perspective does not offer a definitive solution, but it encourages a shift in focus, from reacting to events after they occur to considering the conditions that allow them to develop. It highlights the need for awareness that extends beyond the observable, for an understanding that incorporates both what is seen and what may be inferred from patterns of interaction. Such awareness is inherently complex, requiring a balance between attentiveness and restraint, between recognizing potential risk and avoiding unwarranted assumptions. The case also reinforces the importance of communication in maintaining stability within domestic environments. While the specifics of the interactions in this instance are not fully known, the presence of unresolved conflict suggests that communication was either insufficient or ineffective in addressing the underlying issues. This does not imply that communication alone can prevent all forms of conflict, but it underscores its role as a critical factor in managing tension and preventing its accumulation over time. In considering the broader implications, the case from Wahiawa becomes part of a larger discourse on the nature of internal conflict and the challenges associated with understanding it. It contributes to an ongoing effort to refine how such situations are conceptualized, emphasizing the need for approaches that are sensitive to complexity and that acknowledge the limits of available information. It encourages a perspective that is both analytical and reflective, one that seeks to understand without oversimplifying. Ultimately, the case does not conclude with a sense of resolution in the traditional sense. It does not provide a complete narrative that can be followed from beginning to end without interruption. Instead, it remains partially open, defined by both its established facts and its unresolved elements. This openness is not a deficiency, but a characteristic that reflects the nature of the subject itself, the complexity of human relationships, and the difficulty of fully capturing their dynamics. In the end, what the case leaves behind is not a definitive account, but a structured awareness, a recognition of how internal conflict can develop, how it can remain hidden within familiar environments, and how its consequences can extend beyond the boundaries in which it originates. It serves as a reminder that understanding is often incomplete, that clarity has limits, and that within those limits, there is still value in examining, in reflecting, and in acknowledging the depth of what cannot be entirely known.